Hi, my name is Jesse Weinberg. I'm a researcher at the דיין Center for Middle East and African Studies at Tel Aviv University. The first panel that we are doing this afternoon is entitled The Kurdish Chapter in the Syrian Civil War, Historical and Current Perspectives. The panel will be dealing with the story of the Kurds using the framework of the Syrian Civil War in both a historical and contemporary perspective. But it also will, and this is something that Yoram Schweitzer will be dealing with, we'll deal with the specific issues dealing with the rise and fall of Salafi jihadi groups in Syria. So that's the plan for today. So first, let me introduce our two panelists. Directly to my left, we have Dr. Seth Pranzman. Seth Pranzman is an op-ed editor and Middle East affairs analyst at the Jerusalem Post. He has covered the war against the Islamic State, 3 Gaza wars, the conflict in Ukraine, the refugee crises in Eastern Europe, and has also reported from Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, Senegal, the UAE, and Ukraine. He is also the author.
Can you talk closer?
Okay. Okay. I'll shout.
No problem.
Can you hear me? Okay. So back to Seth. Seth is also the author of a recent book entitled After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East, which was just released this year through Geffen Publishing. Yoram Schweitzer is an expert in international terrorism and the head of the INSS program on terrorism and low-intensity conflict. He has had a distinguished career in the Israeli intelligence community as well as in the academic world. Among his previous positions, he has served as a consultant on counter-terror strategies to the Prime Minister's Office and the Ministry of Defense, as well as the counter-international terror section of the IDF, and a member of the task force dealing with Israeli missing in actions, MIAs, at the Prime Minister's Office. So, we are going to start with Seth, and Seth is going to deal with the Kurdish issue in the historical perspective. Yoram is going to follow him. And finally, third, we are going to be showing, and this is on your program as well, a video from a senior representative of Kurdish forces in northeastern Syria. Our intention is to bring a Kurdish voice from the field, particularly at a time where there are significant developments on the ground, allowing us to hear their first-hand perspective. However, this is going to be anonymous. Recognizing the sensitivity of doing such an undertaking, we are protecting his anonymity, and as such, this particular part is going to be off the record. So without further ado...
You want me to come up there or stay here or what?
I don't mind coming up there again.
Okay. Whatever works for you.
Not a problem. So, I'm supposed to give a bit of an insight, I guess, into the kind of complicated Kurdish polity we have, not only in eastern Syria, but also in northern Iraq. Just by way of background, I spent, since 2014, covering not only the war on ISIS, but especially since 2015, a lot of time going back and forth to Iraq, especially the Kurdish region, to cover the various aspects of that conflict. So I was there in Sinjar when it was first liberated, when some of the first mass graves of Yazidis were discovered. As many of you probably recall, in August of 2014, ISIS had attacked this area called Sinjar, where there is this Yazidi minority, and they had killed thousands of people and kidnapped thousands of women and sold them into slavery. And many of the people that they kidnapped, they then executed. So I also covered the Mosul offensive, and I was there during the Kurdish referendum, or the Kurdistan Regional Government's referendum, in September of 2017. Now, I think it's important, we don't have that map up, I don't know if we can get it back, but anyway, it blinds us if we're sitting there. But we're talking about a huge area of land in Syria and Iraq, and I think since we're talking about Kurds, we should mention the fact that we're talking about 20 to 30 million people who are also in Turkey and in Iran. In fact, interestingly enough, the two countries that have produced the most vibrant current Kurdish movements in a sense of the last few years, because they've appeared to be autonomous regions in eastern Syria and northern Iraq, are actually the place where there are less Kurds, because there's actually more Kurds, I think, in Turkey, in Iran, but we're going to put those aside for a second, although it's connected, and talk about Syria and Iraq. Syria and Iraq used to be two different countries, but I think when ISIS was able to cross the border in June or thereabouts 2014 and conquer a whole swath of mostly Sunni Arab cities. For instance, Mosul, Tikrit, eventually Ramadi, Fallujah, all of those places that we're kind of familiar with, I hope, as Sunni Arab kind of heartland. At that point, Syria and Iraq kind of became the same conflict. Now, why did it become the same conflict in a sense? First of all, because ISIS is there. Second of all, because the people fighting ISIS are often doing it on both sides of the line. So, for instance, the US airstrikes that began after the August offensive into Sinjar by the ISIS and the atrocities and the killing of Stephen Satloff and journalists, airstrikes began first in Sinjar, especially to prevent ISIS from taking over Kurdish areas like Dahuk and Erbil, because ISIS was knocking on the gates not only of Baghdad, but also very close to taking over some key areas of the Kurdistan region. At that time, some of my friends who were in Dahuk and those areas were considering to go back up into the mountains, thinking that ISIS was only about a 10-minute, 20-minute drive from Erbil and Dahuk. That's how serious the emergency was for a few days. So the airstrikes by the Americans then continued, as you probably recall, the city of Kobani, which was under siege and is a Kurdish city or partly Kurdish city in northern Syria, was under siege at the same time. When ISIS launched this offensive, and I think we don't know exactly enough about how ISIS planned this, but ISIS struck towards Baghdad and towards Mosul and the Kurdish region at the same time that it struck towards Kobani and other areas. This is a massive battlefield. So that was a large battlefield. I think we should see it as kind of one interconnected conflict as opposed to Syrian civil war, Iraq, this and that. And insofar as we're talking about the Kurdish issue, which we are supposed to be, I think we need to understand that the Kurdish political parties, which are connected often to armed movements as well, are also part of an ecosystem that is not always based in just one country. So, for instance, if we talk about the PKK, or Kurdistan Workers' Party, which was founded in the 1970s, and obviously had an insurgency or terrorism against Turkey for many years, and of course the groups that came to run eastern Syria, whether you want to call it PYD or YPG, had links to the PKK. When we say links, we can, of course, everyone can debate how that all works, whether it's the same links as the Muslim Brotherhood to Hamas, or it's just, direct. How you want to decide that, it's not my job to decide. But the PKK and YPG and that ecosystem of Kurdish political parties are an ecosystem that exists in Iraq, in Turkey, in Syria, and Iran. So it's not just one place. Now, it may have different names in different places. So PKK, for instance, and the groups that it's linked to, were very good at creating an alphabet soup of names that I think is not worth to go over the 50 different groups that are somehow linked to them a bit, because what we need to know is just which groups are the most powerful. So certainly in eastern Syria, beginning in 2012, the Syrian regime, as you all recall, was under threat by, not under threat, but it was involved in a civil war. It was suppressing brutally a protest movement, which eventually became a civil war in 2012. And at that time, the Syrian regime decided at some point to husband its resources, as any regime would do, and withdraw from some of the Kurdish areas. And the Syrian regime had an interesting reasoning, because it assumed that in the past, the regime had worked with the PKK when Öcalan had lived in Syria up until 1998. And the Syrian regime, for whatever reason, thought or understood that if they withdrew from areas and handed them over a bit to the YPG or PYD, that would be those groups were not trying to overthrow and destroy the regime. Whether it's true, by the way, that the YPG or the Kurdish groups in Syria clash sometimes with the regime, but I don't think there was ever a sense. The YPG never thought that it will overthrow the Syrian regime and replace it with something else. Whatever its ideology was in terms of federalism or local autonomy or Kurdish rights, and certainly Kurds in Syria deserved rights because they had been brutally suppressed by the Assad regime in years past. They deserved rights. Some of them didn't even have citizenship. But I don't think the YPG's ideology was ever that it will totally eradicate the regime. So the regime could say, okay, well, we'll let the YPG kind of have that part in eastern Syria. We'll focus on the real threat, which is in Damascus or Aleppo or Homs or those areas. Now, from that period then, in 2012, 2013, you have all of a sudden a group of Kurds that are able to have a small amount of power that they'd never had before in places like Kamishli and these places. And all of a sudden, just as they're poking their heads up to get a bit of power, they're suddenly attacked, of course, by ISIS and other groups, because there is a civil war that's been taking place in Syria, and the Kurds are clashing not only with Syrian rebels, but they're suddenly being attacked by ISIS, which lays siege to them. So that's the situation that you get to by late 2013, early 2014. Now, at the same time, we should remember, in northern Iraq, not only did ISIS eventually attack northern Iraq, but when ISIS did attack northern Iraq, it also ran into Kurds. Because ISIS's main enemy was primarily what it saw as the Shiite Iranian regime in Baghdad. And its main support, of course, was primarily from Sunni Arabs in places like Mosul. And eventually, from Sunni jihadists all over the world. You'll give me like a time thing, right? Okay. So, what's interesting is that when it got into Iraq, the KDP, or Kurdistan Democratic Party, which is the leading party in northern Iraq, and we should say, in contrast to the YPG or PYD, which may have links or origins connected to PKK, which is a radical leftist or Marxist kind of group, the KDP is a purely Kurdish nationalist group, which I think you could accurately describe as center or center-right. It's slightly more conservative, it's a bit more into traditions, family values. It's certainly not a radical leftist group. And so I would say that the KDP is kind of, when we talk about, and I was saying it's a kind of an ecosystem of Kurdish parties in that kind of area, we should see it as, primarily two large movements, i.e. PKK and things that are linked more closely to it, and KDP and things that are linked more closely to it. And in that sense, we could mention, therefore, that the KDP in northern Iraq, which has had an autonomous region as a Kurdistan autonomous region since the 1990s, had relatively decent relations with the AKP party in Turkey. Whereas, as you know, since 2015, the PKK Turkish ceasefire broke down and there was a vicious conflict in Kurdish regions in eastern Turkey. So I think we need to remember a bit that nothing in this region is ever simple. It's not always Kurds versus Turks or the Syrian regime versus that. It can be more complex. So when ISIS invaded northern Iraq, the Kurdistan region didn't know exactly what to do and wondered whether or not how this will all work out. And they waited to see what ISIS will do, and eventually ISIS attacked them. When we fast forward a bit then to, say, 2017, what's very interesting is there is kind of a high point of these two Kurdish groups. You have the YPG, which has eventually transitioned into what they call the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, which was partly a change that was encouraged by the Americans, supplying weapons to eastern Syria to help them fight ISIS. And the SDF is ostensibly a non-Kurdish group. It's led by Kurds, but it has non-Kurdish elements, Arabs, Christians, other groups in it. So when we talk about eastern Syria and we see the kind of Kurdish power that rose there, or whatever you want to describe it as, it is incorrectly described sometimes as a state-building project. It was, I think it never fully understood what the end goal was. Whereas when we look at northern Iraq, Kurdish region, when we get to 2017 and while ISIS is being defeated, I think the northern Iraqi Kurdish government, primarily KDP, decided to make a very different choice, which was it decided to have a referendum on independence. And I think the KDP's reasoning was interesting in this respect. It thought that, listen, when this conflict is going to be over,
about 2 different moments.
This conflict's going to be over. We don't really want to have to work with a strong Baghdad after this. We wouldn't mind having independence, or at least have some power in our hands. They had an independence referendum. Most people in northern Iraq voted for independence in the Kurdish region. And because of that, in 2017, the Baghdad Iraqi government punished them and closed their airports and launched an offensive into the oil-rich area of Kirkuk and took a bunch of land away from this Kurdish region. I think hobbling the Kurdish region a bit, although 2 years later now, I think it's come back from that. The Kurdish region is financially independent, it's very wealthy, it's very safe. Whereas the contrast is eastern Syria, where in fact it looked like the SDF was controlling a huge swath of territory, as you saw, a third of Syria. But the SDF never had a strong economic foundation, and it never had good relations with the areas around it. The Turks were always chomping at the bit to launch an offensive, and it didn't even have good relations with the KDP in northern Iraq. So I think when we come now to this period where we're at today, which we'll talk about then, you know, we've seen a kind of Kurdish spring in 2017, 2016, 2018, and you know, it has led to a very interesting place now, which is you still have a very strong Kurdistan regional government in northern Iraq, which is led primarily by the KDP, with the PUK as a kind of slightly junior partner, which has relatively amicable relations with Turkey, and actually okay relations with Iran, to be honest. And then you've got eastern Syria, which is a huge question mark. It looks like to be a place that, you know, there will be a kind of low-level, slow-burning conflict in which the YPG will have to be eventually subsumed back into the Syrian regime somehow in a deal that's brokered by the Russians, because, of course, they understand that if that doesn't happen, there will be another Turkish offensive. And I think also we should just add that America was deeply responsible for helping to create the Kurdistan Regional Government in northern Iraq. It's the American no-fly zone that enabled it to come into existence. Some people believed that the Americans would stay in eastern Syria and enable that to happen again. And the American decision in December 2018 and then October of this year certainly closed the lid on that and said, no, 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 there's not going to be any more experiments, there's no more Kosovos, there's no more East Timors. Syria is going back to the Syrian regime.